Thank you very much. As always, Mr. Rajvi, it's wonderful to be with you. And of course, it's worth the whole trip to simply see the display room of all of the pictures, all of the demonstrations. And I'm hoping that after today, I'll be able to get a map of all of the places that you have on the wall where demonstrations and other things broke out. Because when you look at that map and you see how many different cities had something going on, it makes it very clear. I also want to point out that when you have Senator Toriseli and me both here, this is a bipartisan commitment with a Democrat and a Republican. In Washington, you don't often get that right now. But we do, this is one of the topics increasingly bringing people together, I believe. Now, I may have been wrong about one aspect, and I say this recognizing that so many of you know so much more than I do about what's going on in Iran. But in a funny way, the Obama strategy of turning the money over to the dictatorship may have backfired because people believed they were going to get the money. And there was a heightened sense that maybe things will get better. And I don't think it occurred to them that the money was going to be diverted to corruption, and the money was going to be diverted to Syria, and to Yemen, to South Lebanon. And all of a sudden, I think the level of anger was greater because this hope had been built up that things were going to somehow get better. But the challenge for the dictatorship is that things can't get better. The level of corruption it now takes to maintain the Revolutionary Guard means that more and more and more money will be diverted from normal people to the forces of oppression. And as they grow more corrupt, they grow more greedy. And so I think you see this tension that's building between the forces of oppression who are only sustained with lots of money, and the average Iranian who doesn't have access to either the power or the money. What you're doing, each of you, by being here today, what you do at that huge annual meeting, which is, frankly, for me, was a turning point when I looked out and saw so many thousand people from all over the world. And it was obvious that something big is happening. Now, for any of my friends who are still not quite convinced that the MEK is a real force, I suggested to them that when the Iranian dictatorship asked the president of France to restrict one person who's sitting here, and the president of France said no, France is not. By the way, the great irony, of course, is France is where Khomeini was in exile from the Shah, and the cassettes from Khomeini came from Paris. So now here is the dictatorship begging that the next generation of change, but I tell my friends in the United States, I don't believe that the dictatorship singled out Mrs. Rajavi just as an exercise. I believe the level of fear that is growing for a very practical reason. You have survived. You have endured. You have continued with your mission. And they haven't been able to stop you. And the morale loss, the prestige loss that they suffered was very real. I mean, it's very hard right now for any person open to facts to suggest that the current dictatorship is a legitimate government. It is clearly sustained only by fear, by torture, and I must say to the two young people who spoke, it's very humbling to realize what you have endured because of your belief in freedom for Iran. And so I'm grateful for your witness here today. But all of this is building pressure. You'll notice that the American president has sent back a note that he expects to continue to unravel the agreement that was made by Obama with the dictatorship. And you'll see more activities in that direction. there's very serious effort underway to think through, I think, how to undermine the regime. Because the people who are now advising President Trump, when you look at General Kelly's background, you look at General Mattis's background, you look at General McMaster's background, they all had Americans killed by the dictatorship. I mean, every single one of them knows that in Iraq, there were weapons being provided by the dictatorship. There were training being provided by the dictatorship. They have no illusions about some moderate wing of the dictatorship. There is an evil wing of the dictatorship, and there's a pretty evil wing of the dictatorship, and there's no innocent wing of the dictatorship. Now, I think this is a long, difficult struggle. I think it's an important struggle. As all of you know, I publicly advocate, I mean, I don't hide any of this, I advocate very aggressively that we do more, that we, the United States, do more things. I also hope that with the evidence you now have of nationwide discontent, that you'll be able to reach out even more to Iranians around the world to get them engaged in helping liberate their own country. I currently have a chance to regularly see a statue of Garibaldi, who was the great liberator of Italy. And Garibaldi was sustained by people from Great Britain and elsewhere, and he gradually organized a movement that ultimately led to the creation of modern Italy. And in a way, what you are doing is very similar to Garibaldi. You are knitting together, both in the country and in the world, a tremendous force that is sustaining the right to believe that you can be free. I also think you have one enormous advantage, and that is something I've witnessed over and over again, both in private conversations, in coming to your larger meetings, and in talking with people. I happen to be in conversation now with I used to teach history, and so I like history. And I have run across somebody who's written two major works on Persia and the whole nature of the culture. And what comes through is pride. That one of the things that the dictatorship can't break, and you saw it, the testimony here today, is pride. A willingness of people to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to let you intimidate me. I'm not going to let you stop me. You may kill me, you may put me in jail, but you're not going to break my will. This is very different than some countries. There are countries where people say, oh, well, I guess there's nothing we can do. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think what you have is a gradual conversion of more and more Iranians who are saying, I'm not going to put up with this. And I looked at these pictures of people who know that when they're standing there with their face uncovered, allowing a picture to be made, they know the security force is going to figure out who they are. Now, because these, after all, it's not like the dictatorship started last week. Everybody who lives in Iran today understands the nature of the dictatorship. They understand the nature of the prisons. They understand the threat of being tortured. And yet they stood together and they defied it. That's an amazing thing, an amazing act of courage. My prediction is you're going to see more demonstrations. You'll see waves of outbursts. Frankly, it's much more normal to have demonstrations in the summer than in the winter for obvious reasons. And I suspect this spring and summer could be a very, very important time. I think you have three great opportunities, if you don't mind my saying so, as an outsider who's very impressed with what you've already done. I think your first opportunity is to convince every Iranian in the diaspora across the whole world that this is their moment, that they have a moral responsibility, that they have an opportunity, that they can help network, they can help find resources, they can help increase the amount of information going back in, they can help people start to get organized. There are things that are being done that I think are going to increase our ability to enable people to communicate with each other despite the dictatorship. And there are other things that can be done to move in that direction. Second, I think it's very important that you take things like the display you have here, and you find ways, for example, to make a copy of that room and have it go around the United States or have it go around Europe so people can be invited to see it. It's very, very impressive when you see this and you realize how real these people are. And you realize how important that we reach out, we who are relatively safe, reach out in our prayers and in our thoughts and in our voices to reinforce the people who are taking such extraordinary risks. And the third thing I think is to continue to call upon the governments of countries that do have a sense of decency to condemn and to refuse to tolerate this kind of behavior. For the very first time in the last couple of weeks, I've seen European governments, which historically would have done nothing, finally feeling, I think, embarrassed and compelled to say something because it was so obvious. And of course, every time there's an act of repression, it brings up the history of repression. So it gives us an excuse to educate people about what happened in 1988. It gives us an excuse to remind people how many prisoners have gone through those prisons, how many prisoners have, quote, committed suicide, meaning they were killed by the dictatorship. And I think every one of these rounds, with each passing demonstration, you will find more and more countries that simply can't stomach the dictatorship, and that will undermine it. One last observation as a historian. What happens to dictatorships like this is gradually they lose any moral authority. And now you're just down to brute force and to people who are getting paid to be repressive, but who go home at night sickened by what they're doing. In my mind, as a historian, I have no doubt that Khomeini has suffered a tremendous moral defeat. That he had, any claim he had to being the legitimate moral leader is undermined every time a person stands up to protest. And when they have to rely on sheer force, I think, you know, it's one thing to do that early in the history of a regime, but they've now been relying on force more and more for a very long time, and they've had more and more young people who've basically said no. So the level of discontent, the level of rejection of the dictatorship is deeper today than ever before. So I want to encourage you. Sometimes history is a difficult process. You are making a difference. The MEK is making a difference. I have no doubt but that in the long run you are on the side of history because you're on the side of freedom, and it's the natural desire of people to be able to govern themselves, not to have someone dictate to them. And so your being here today is a part of the historic process by which the Iranian people will rediscover freedom and by which the dictatorship will ultimately be repudiated. And I thank you for your courage, for your commitment, for your willingness to come here. And I thank you for the dedicated leadership you have shown over and over.